I'm Tessa Winchester, and I'm a mentee on the Military Sciences Rising Star scheme here at the Royal United Services Institute on Whitehall. Each month, usually Andy hosts an interview with a senior leader from within the UK Armed Forces, exploring the issues that face defence today and tomorrow, giving you the inside story on how the military orientates itself to face future challenges. However, this month on A Call to Arms, we speak to the interviewer himself, Andrew Young. Andy is the Military Sciences Community Manager at Rusi. Prior to joining Rusi, Andy was a Royal Navy Training Management Officer, specialising in professional military education. He's taught courses at several locations, including the Royal Marines Commando Training Centre. He also holds a Master of Philosophy in International Relations and Politics and a Bachelor of Arts in War Studies. Andy, good morning, and thank you for joining us today. How does it feel to be on the podcast as an interviewee rather than an interviewer today, Andy?
A little bit daunting, to be perfectly honest, because there is a danger that this becomes the world according, or the gospel according to Young. And as I've been told on many occasions in the past, I'm not the cleverest person in the room, and sometimes less is definitely more. But it's fantastic to actually be able to sit down and sort of give some of my thoughts on what we've heard over the past year from some of the interviewees, and really look at how all of these threads really tie together. So thank you for agreeing to do this, and looking forward to it.
Absolutely. I know I'm really excited as well to hear your answers and thoughts on these questions. I think, as always, I'm sure all the listeners know who you are and what you do and what Rusi is, but it would be great to have a brief introduction as to what your role is at Rusi and also where Rusi stands today as an organisation.
Certainly. So my role was really something new for Rusi, which was about going out to primarily our primary customer, which is the UK military and military from overseas, and really connecting at a base level with those personnel and giving practitioners access to all of the fantastic research that people like Dr. Jack Watling, Justin Bronk, Dr. Kelshall, and others, including Dr. Ashbridge, the other members of the team, put out there. Because we're very good at talking to people at the top, at the higher echelons. Well, actually, how do you develop them? How do you get people to that level? Is by engaging further down the chain of command. And from my own experience being a training manager, the questions that you sometimes get from those lower echelons, from the fresh-faced ABs, privates, etc., all the way up, and the young officers, are sometimes far more telling than some of the conversations you have higher up the chain. So that's why I was brought in. I'd say it was something new for Rusi. Hopefully it's been a success, but we'll hold out on that one. Where does Rusi stand today? So Rusi's mission really is about heightening the public debate on defence and security in the UK and further afield. Yes, we are an august institution, quite old, go back to the Duke of Wellington in 1831. And it's interesting to actually note that the Duke of Wellington is instrumental in building two institutions. One of them is Rusi, and the other one is King's College London. And you see these two things going hand in hand in many ways, and in some respects we need to break that. In other respects, it works quite well together. But it's interesting that you've got these two institutions which are built at around about the same time, and indeed at the same time. But what's interesting about Rusi is that we sit really at that practitioner nexus, where it's about taking a look at the context of the world, what's going on, taking a look at the developments within militaries and where they're looking at their next challenges, and saying, actually, how do we cross this divide between the abstract conceptualization and the concrete experience and experimentation, and how do we bring those two things together? What's really interesting at the moment, of course, is that barely a week goes past, and at one point barely a day went past, when you didn't hear from Rusi experts on Radio 4, on Sky News, and in the printed press as well. Now, why is that? That is undoubtedly because Rusi has connections and it has a convening power, which means that our researchers and our associates can work across that broad spectrum and actually drill down into some of the specifics that practitioners need to know about and need to develop their minds and their thinking on. So where are we today? We're a growing organisation, we're a membership organisation, but we're also delivering real impact and real effect in terms of policy making and practitioner development. And I think that is really quite key because it goes all the way back to that early charter, the 1831. What are we there for? We were a United Services Club, effectively, and it was there to actually engage personnel with their profession, with their thought processes, and actually develop leaders, not just for today, but for tomorrow. And bringing that cross-service, that cross-departmental, that cross-ministerial and policy level thinking together so that you actually create a more coherent whole. So that's where I think we are today. There'll be people in Rusi who disagree with that, and that's the joy of living and working in Rusi, because Rusi doesn't have a party line. It is a collection of individuals who are able to do the thinking, who are able to convene, and who are able to bring all of those disparate groups together to actually try and forge a way forward, which is a really exciting place to be, because there are things that you would never think about and you'd never expect to come out of the woodwork, but they really do. And we've seen some of that recently with, and I'll go back to the Ukraine example. On the one hand, we've had people talking about the need to reduce lethal effect and wide effect weapons in urban areas. And on the other hand, we're also talking about how do you actually fight through urban areas, and to do that, you need more lethal and wide effect. So you've got these two competing elements, and that's where Rusi sits. It brings all of that together to try and force and forge a way through.
Absolutely, that was a great answer and really interesting to hear about the evolution of Rusi. I'm intrigued to know what your reason was for wanting to be an interviewee today on the podcast rather than the interviewer.
I think primarily because we've heard so many different elements come out of the interviews over the past year or so. And what I tried to do when I was interviewing was really pick up on something that Professor Richard Harding from Westminster University talked about in one of his books, which was the idea of militaries as requiring a perception or a vision for success, structures that match that vision and what they think they're going to be successful, and then a lived experience to actually recruit, retain, and train those people that you have. So I try to use those as sort of the core spiral around which all the questions and all the answers originated and came back to. But I think it's very useful if we actually do stop, take a step back and go, well, did they actually answer those questions? What is that core spiral that we're seeing? And is it coherent in the way that we, from an academic perspective, we'd love to see that coherence? And it's very easy to try and design something, but actually where practice meets, where academia meets practice, and where you get that virtuous cycle, it's very difficult because academia can inform and practice can inform academia, but actually designing something that works, that has that coherent thread, that golden thread that runs through it, is incredibly difficult, because it's like stepping into a stream. The water's always moving. So you can try and aim off as much as you want, but you're always going to be against a current of some sort. Something will be trying to knock you off course. So I find it very interesting perhaps to talk about some of that and go, well, what is the key thing that has emerged? And I think personally, the key thing that has emerged is people. People are at the heart of defence. It's not just an investor in people plaque that you put up on the wall. The fundamental point of all of this has been, you've got to have the right people, you've got to have your people thinking effectively, and you've got to have your people acting efficiently and effectively too. And if you don't build your structures and that vision of success around those people, then you end up in a very dangerous and difficult place.
Mm.
So I think bringing that out and bringing that to the fore would be quite an interesting conversation to have.
Absolutely. And how well, just coming off from that, how well do you think the armed forces does in selecting the right people, or the Ministry of Defence on a wider scale? Do you think it is effective in selecting the right people in certain positions, or do you think that it is something that it needs to work on as an institution?
Again, this is where there's a danger of the gospel according to Young. However, from my own experience, I think the amount of quality you get going into the armed forces is superb. And you see this in phase one training establishments, whether it be Army, RAF, Navy. The baseline that you get going in, and we talk sometimes in disparaging terms, but actually, these are fantastic young people. A lot of them have overcome a lot of challenge in their lives. I can think of one in particular who I mentored at sixth form, who then went on to be an infanteer, and proudest moment of his life. He felt that his father was there with him when he passed off, which was really heartbreaking because the guy was, it was a very challenging situation. But it's how do you, for me, what I notice and what I see is you get these people who come in, they have all the enthusiasm in the world, they want to make a difference, and the big question is not selecting them in, because we do that really well, really effectively. That's actually something that I'd say the military has got very good at. Yes, there are teething problems with the recruitment process when you outsource it to Capita or wherever else, and you're bringing in people who don't necessarily know about it, and you're putting systems in place which aren't perfect. But the actual people coming in are very good. How do you maintain that enthusiasm? How do you maintain that hunger to be better, and not just put them into a sausage grinder of a career pattern and path, which perhaps has been where the military has struggled over the last decade or so. Interestingly, particularly with things like Project Castle, with the Agile Future Soldier programs, you can see the sort of problems being teased out, particularly in the Army. The Royal Navy now has a head of talent, another captain who is currently looking at how do you create better staff officers, how do you get really good staff officers and develop them. And I know the RAF are going through something very similar, as we heard from Air Marshal Turner. So I think it's really a question of maintaining that enthusiasm, selecting the right people based on knowledge, skills, and attitudes, which we supposedly do. But there's a whole piece in there about the OJAR, which the Officers Joint Appraisal system, and the SJAR, which is the other ranks joint appraisal system, which needs tweaking, because these are structures and processes designed to get you a certain product at the end of them. Well, not everybody in the military fits that singular product. And there are some great examples of personnel who are fantastic in the field, rubbish in barracks, and vice versa. You've got some people who have got brains the size of planets and can see the strategic picture, but they're useless at the tactical and the technical, and vice versa. So how do you get somebody who matches all of that all the way through, and how do you develop them? Well, a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work. We know that. And I think what we're seeing now with the British military in particular is a move away from that one-size-fits-all, a move to a more individual development program. Yes, we need people to go along the conveyor belt and promote in certain positions and so on and so forth. But we've got to recognise and understand that fundamentally militaries are made up of individuals. They come together and the team works, but the team only works because of those individuals working together. Developing that, we can do it in phase one because we've got a very basic, right, you'll be able to achieve this standard, this operational standard. How you do that through a career is a much more difficult proposition. And actually, if we're going to look at it from a career perspective, we also need to bring in the idea of the whole force, and a lot of people have spoken about the whole force, and think about, right, people's career goals go hand in hand with their life goals. So at what point are people going to be saying, right, I want to have a family now, right, I need to be settled down in an area? What point are they going to be wanting those things that give them connection to the people around them, those things that give them a sense of purpose, a sense of fulfillment? And how do we build that into this career stream and actually get them the best from our people as a result? It's a really interesting problem. It's one which is, I'd say, almost unique to the military, in terms of the military, well, duty comes first and everything else is a secondary. But actually, if you don't look after your people, you don't give them that sense of fulfillment, that sense of purpose, and all of those holistic things, well, you're going to be left in a manpower deficit, or a personnel deficit, rather. And that's going to be something that you are always going to struggle against. And it was actually current First Sea Lord, when he was Flag Officer Sea Training, so a few years ago, he described this problem as having a half-inflated balloon. Every time you think you've gripped it in one area, the air moves to another, and you find that you've got a problem there. So it's that holistic view across the whole piece, and how do you even it out? How do you balance it out? Well, I think that's the interesting place that we're going to.
Absolutely, I think it is definitely a huge issue and really complex, and I think that analogy is a really great one to describe it. I think what would be really interesting to understand is, when you first joined the Navy in 2008, what challenges was the British military facing at that time?
So it's interesting, because I came across from the army. I was at Sandhurst first. I was selected for Sandhurst way back in 2001, I think it was, as an army scholar. And then, of course, I was at military boarding school, then at King's College London doing war studies. So I was very green, in quite possibly the most naive and worst way possible, with a little bit of knowledge from my own personal background, and then studying at university. And really, I came into the army, and the army was an interesting place, because it was coming to terms with the fact that the army that it had in 2007 was not the army that it needed. Mm-hmm. The army that existed prior to 2007 really was one that was founded on conventional warfare principles, was structured for it, which had a lived experience which was very much about that. And its operational experience from 2003 to 2007 was primarily counterinsurgency. So how do you square that? And there were big ructions at the time. Do you transform the army to fight the war that it's fighting at the time, or a possible war in the future? And I think one of the key things to remember there is that the armies have always changed and adapted to fight the war that they're actually fighting at the time. And then they revert to whatever conflict or theory of conflict that they're going to fight in the future. But you always restructure to fight the war you're fighting at the time. And a great example of that is World War I, World War II, etc. And also, when you look at that, those aren't fought by professional armies. They're won by citizen armies. So it's a very different proposition to the army that you start the war with in the first place. So that's an interesting piece, and that was a challenge the British military, the British Army, was trying to overcome. Cross-decking to the Royal Navy, there's a very different perspective, mm-hmm. and something very different going on. The Royal Navy in 2008, 3 years previous, they'd had the Sea Harriers taken from them, so they no longer had their own organic fixed wing. It was Joint Force Harrier, ground attack Harriers. They had 2 landing platform docks, a landing platform helicopter, a full brigade of Royal Marines, and the Royal Marines were being hived off to go to Afghanistan. So where was the Royal Navy's amphibious force? It was in Afghanistan. It was doing counterinsurgency. Add on to that, they'd had over the previous decade or so, slightly longer, serious cuts to the number of escorts, so frigates and destroyers. Its number of carriers was also being reduced steadily. It was down to 2 when I joined, and very quickly went down to 1. So you've got a very different sort of feel to the fleet. It's one of contraction. It's one of not really sure what it's doing and what its purpose was. But on the horizon were the 2 new carriers and the new Joint Strike Fighter and all of these good things, and a new round of spending which would give you more SSN submarines, the Astute class coming on board or coming online. Sorry, the Type 45 air defence destroyer was going to be this great air defence platform, but we didn't have any new frigates coming. We had very few offshore patrol vessels. And it was all very much about the platforms. You can hear it when I'm talking. It's about the platforms. It's not about the people. It's about the platforms. So I think there was a bit of a disconnect there. And you also had a sense within the Navy that they were reverting to, and somebody put it as saying the Royal Navy at the time had 4 enemies. Number 1 was the French, because history happened on one day in 1805, 21st of October 1805. You could be forgiven if that's the only day that matters in naval history. Second enemy was the Royal Air Force. They for no other reason than you've got 2 competing visions of expeditionary power. One is you go airborne, the other is you go maritime. Well, actually, they're not competing; they're complementary. The third enemy is the Treasury, because the Treasury are always going to ask you to do more with less. And finally, it's whoever you happen to be fighting at the time. Now, when you get into that mentality and it seeps in, it becomes slightly siege mentality. And I'd actually argue that it's fundamentally wrong in the first place, not least because the first 3 are quite facetious statements. But Royal Navies aren't, the Royal Navy or navies in general are not there to fight. Navies fundamentally are not there to fight. They are there to maintain trade and diplomacy. If your Navy is fighting, then something has gone wrong. Your trade, your diplomacy, all of that wider soft power has failed. Navies are there to maintain good order at sea. And there was a sense, certainly amongst the people who I went through training with, and the Navy that I saw, we were very much still geared towards, we are there to fight. Now, that's what you do. You have to be prepared to do that. That's the end state. Not the end state, but that's what you have to do in order to secure everything else in the ultimate challenge. But if you concentrate on fighting, you're missing the bigger picture. And a great example of that and way to explain it is, let's look at Trafalgar, just as an example. The war doesn't end at Trafalgar. It lasts for 10 more years. And in that time, only 1/8 of the fleet is the line of battle fleet. That only 1/8 of it is designed to fight at sea and destroy something at sea. The rest of it is what we would class today as offshore patrol vessels and corvettes. It's there for constabulary purposes. But the Royal Navy is very much focused now, and it's got two primary missions really: continuous at sea deterrence. Well, that's a whole force element, because you've got to protect those nuclear armed boats, and then it's carrier-enabled power projection, the carrier strike group. So those are the two primary roles. Everything else is secondary or tertiary. So that's the challenge that they were facing. How do you change that mindset to go from one of almost being under siege, because you keep losing in the defence estimates, but you've got this promise of jam tomorrow, to one where actually you are reorientated to the reality of what navies are there to do. So it's a really interesting challenge that they had. I'm not sure if they've overcome it, because I'm no longer serving, so I can't see a lot of that. And I'll hold off on saying anything about the Air Force, because I know absolutely nothing about them from a personal perspective. I've seen them out on operations, but they're not my part of ship.
I think what you mentioned about the relationship between the Navy and the Air Force is really interesting. How has that, can you offer more about how that has evolved throughout even just the last couple of decades, and whether there is strong communication links in place for the two to work together, or if there are disagreements, talk that out?
I think the relationship between the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy is superficially bad.
Mm-hmm.
And I say superficially bad because young naval officers, it's almost drummed into you that the Royal Air Force killed off the carriers in 1966. The Royal Air Force so badly mismanaged the maritime patrol aircraft that the Nimrod were killed off. The Royal Air Force, and it's this litany of the Royal Air Force, the Royal Air Force, the Royal Air Force. It's rubbish. It's absolutely rubbish, because actually the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy, we are an island nation. So the British Army has got to get to where it needs to go via the air or sea.
Mm-hmm.
That's how it's going to get to where it needs to go, one way or t'other. So funny old thing, what are the ways that it can do that? Well, one is the Royal Air Force, one is the Royal Navy. Royal Air Force goes in and can do the advance party. And you see this in Sierra Leone actually really effectively. Royal Air Force goes in with 16 Air Assault Brigade, and the Paris land at Freetown Airport. I say Freetown Airport, I know what I mean. And then 3 Commander Brigade follows up. So you've got the two working in tandem. It works. And we see it again in other environments as well. It works together. How you break that down and actually get the two to work together is supposedly the job, or supposed to be why we have a singular Ministry of Defence. Mm-hmm. But that requires you to have a singular strategic vision of what British defence is there to do. And I don't think we've got that. Mm-hmm. So unless you actually get that direction from the top, it becomes very difficult to integrate all the way down. Now, interestingly, you see for example, the Carrier Strike Group, Op Fortis, went out to the Pacific, 7-month long deployment, 9-month really for the matlows, for the sailors, and about 7 months for the embarked carrier group, the embarked forces, the 617 Squadron, and their ancillaries and detachments. Now that's very interesting. It's a great photo op. It's a fantastic show of force in the region, and to support your allies, to show a bit of resolve. But look at what that did to the Joint Strike Fighter, to to 617 Squadron, who now have to do a big regain to get back up to scratch on some of their other skills. And again, there's a bit of disconnect in what we need the Lightning to actually deliver the F-35B. Some people want it to deliver maritime strike, i.e. taking out surface vessels and close air support or combat air patrols. Some people want it to do SEAD or DEAD, suppression of enemy air defence or destruction of enemy air defence. And it depends what side of the pond I say side of the pond, but what side of the fence you're on depends what you want it to do. Mm-hmm. And actually, if you're going to integrate the F-35 with the Royal Marines and the Littoral Strike Group, you need it to do SEAD and DEAD. That's a fundamental. But you also need it to do CAP, because if you don't have combat air power and you don't have air superiority, the enemy's going to strike you. Mm-hmm. So it's a multi-role aircraft, but we've got too few of them. Well, what do you prioritise in the near term? And we've got to see that come from both sides, both from the Royal Air Force and from the Royal Navy, an agreement on what the primary role is in the short term in order for it to become effective. Are we going to see that? I don't know. Not least because the Royal Navy is building around the Carrier Strike Group, but the Carrier Strike Group can't do. It's there to affect something. Mm-hmm. It doesn't exist for the sake of it self-existing. What is it there to affect? Well, theatre entry. So who is it there to serve? Well, it's there to serve 3 Commando Brigade. Mm-hmm. And it's only when you pull in that piece of the puzzle that it makes sense. Are the Royal Marines integrated into the F-35B? Arguable. Mm-hmm. So it's part of this bigger picture. It needs direction from the top, because if you don't have that direction, you're going to see divergence, and not convergence. And Vice Admiral Burns talked about being able to aggregate and disaggregate the carrier strike group. That's great, but fundamentally you've got to aggregate all of those elements in order to have effect. And it goes right up to the top, and it comes all the way down to the bottom to the Royal Marine Section Commander, who is going in to do future commando effect on target. Well, fundamentally, he needs to get to the shore. And at the moment, I don't know if they can do that if the F-35B is being tasked to two different missions, two different effects.
Absolutely. I think that was a really comprehensive answer. And I think I can only imagine that it's so difficult for each regiment to have its own strategic objectives and then also align this with the greater force. It seems that really strong communication ties and leadership as well from the top down, as you say, is really, really important. I think moving on to today's environment, the armed forces are obviously facing several new challenges. The integrated review describes the threat from hostile states to the UK and its allies as growing and diversifying, taking on many different new forms. Several states do continue to be a concern for the armed forces, including states like Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Do you feel that the armed forces has evolved to effectively counter these threats, both, the pre-existing threats that we've just discussed from the late 2000 and late 2008, also up to the 2020s? Do you think that the armed forces have evolved effectively to counter these new threats too?
Honestly, I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
because you never know until you're actually in the line of fire whether you have the change and adaptation you've gone through has been enough or is right. Mm. That's the problem with armed forces. A surgeon gets to practice every day to make sure he's at the top of his game, or at the top of her game. Sorry, but the military professional can't. So it's very difficult to determine. I think the very fact that you've got this huge swathe of opponents, whether it be, as you say, whether it be Russia or potential opponents. I mean, Russia we know is an opponent. Mm-hmm. Let's just clear that up straight away. Whether it be Russia, I mean, you mentioned China, Iran, North Korea. Mm. Well, each of those is in a different geographic position. Each of those poses a different threat, to be honest, and each of those requires a different response as a result. Is the British military big enough? Does it have enough mass? Does it have enough white space or blue space in terms of thinking to be able to actually counter each of those, if not simultaneously, which it really doesn't, then as a meaningful part of a wider alliance or coalition, or can we go it alone against a single element? Well, I would argue that if you don't focus on one, you're not going to be capable of doing anything. And it's a bit like the Clausewitzian thing that if you defend everywhere, you defend nothing. Yeah. Well, actually, you need to decide what your chief threat is. Mm-hmm. And I'd argue that the chief threat to the British military today, and it's a similar threat facing most European defence, if not Western defence in toto, is a lack of industrial resilience. Mm-hmm. and a lack of industrial mass. You just have to look at the huge amounts of expenditure in munitions going on in the Donbass, and the fact that the Ukrainians are running short. And we've known the Ukrainians are running short. Well, we're now depleting our stocks to the extent where it's going to take years to rebuild. That's not good enough. And unfortunately, we also saw this in 1982 down south. We were running out of ammunition before the Argentines were. Mm-hmm. You need to have that industrial resilience. Do we have it? Because if you don't have that industrial resilience, you're not going to be able to rearm effectively. You're not going to be able to put money into research and development and thus prepare for the next one. And you're not going to be able to ramp up production when you need it to deal with the crisis. We have gone too far down the line of efficiencies and just-in-time logistics. That means that it doesn't matter whether we can put put people in the field for 30 days on our ready locker stocks, our war stocks, because we're going to expend that in a very short order, far quicker than we actually think we're going to expend it. It's going to be gone. The question is, what do you do for the next 6 months? And that is a key component. And just to put it into context, when I was at Santos, there was a video going around which was of C Company PWRR, the Prince of Wales's Royal Regiment, defending a platoon house in Basra. And at one point, a guy comes running onto the screen and chucks an ammunition box to 3 lads who are up on the roof. That ammunition box was full of loose ammunition. It hadn't been put into boxes. It hadn't been put into speed loaders or all the rest of it that you need in a firefight to get into your magazine quickly to put rounds down onto the target zone. Why was that? We weren't prepared for it. Now, if you're not prepared to do things like that, if you don't have that all ready to go, how are you going to be able to actually go and have an effect over a prolonged period against some of these actors who will be looking at things on a completely different timescale to you? So I think when you're looking at the evolution of the British military, yes, we can talk about the sharp end of it, but actually it's what sits behind that is really interesting. And when you look at the evolution of the British military historically, it wasn't the evolution of tactics, techniques, and procedures. It was the evolution of logistics. It was the fact that we could mobilize everything from finance through to the Industrial Revolution. And don't forget, the Industrial Revolution was actually built on the Royal Navy. It was the Royal Navy who created the industrial processes for industrial manufacturing, who needed the copper to sheet their ships, etc., etc., etc. This came from that, and it then fed out into the rest of society. But that's how you evolve a navy. You build and a wider military. You build a logistic base which can support something that is far beyond the initial contact.
I think that's really interesting as well, because I think often the domains of war that we see that are more exciting today are things like space and cyber warfare, but actually, and although it may not be as exciting, ensuring that we do have enough equipment in case we do go to war and have that conventional, traditional warfare is so important. And as you mentioned with the example of Ukraine, that just illustrates how important it is that we can support our allies and support ourselves in case that we do need to. So that was a really interesting answer. Thank you. I'm intrigued to know what you think about the more abstract challenges that the British Army faces today. Things like climate change, that obviously as a world, these are threats, more transnational threats rather than just, threats that from other states. The Ministry of Defence is the largest single contributor to greenhouse gas emissions within the UK's central government. And we saw that in November 2021, the Ministry of Defence did actually publish its climate change sustainability strategic approach. I'm intrigued to know how effective you thought that approach was in actually setting down goals, and more generally, how effective you feel the military is doing in adapting to counter climate change as a threat.
It's really interesting. I mean, it's a huge challenge. It's one that the British Army is working on, and you look at the stuff going on down at Armour Trials and Development Unit in terms of battery packs and how do we create that sustainable fuel and all those kind of bits and pieces. The Royal Navy looking at actually how's it going to keep its carrier at sea when its carrier burns a huge amount of fuel every day. And all the other vessels as well. I think with climate change, I think we're almost coming at it from the wrong angle. We're coming at it from the perspective that it is good to do and therefore we should do it, which it is, obviously. We don't want to be, can't, if the planet is inhospitable, there's nothing worth fighting over in the first place. Let's just put it out there. It's going to be survival for the entire race. Or species rather. But I think in terms of the military, actually look at it as a logistics challenge. how do you create a military that is not dependent on very finite resources? How do you create a military where you are not having to expend huge amounts of resource to get a consumable to the front line, like fuel? Because if you remove that burden from the logistical chain, you free everything else up for other things which are important. So I think if you actually shift the focus to being how do we make our militaries more effective and efficient, decoupled from a very rigid logistical structure, then that will actually drive a bit more innovation. It will drive more development in terms of tactics, techniques, procedures, and operational constructs. And that will change your ability and your tempo. So I think that will be the really key and interesting question. And you can see this going back centuries. On the one hand, you need a very effective logistical chain in order to actually maintain your fighting power. On the other hand, you have to be able to source it from as close to the front line as possible to ensure that you're still able to move forward and to have effect, and you don't run down too quickly. So I think if we make it a logistical challenge, if we make it something that is more about having military effect in a degraded environment and preparing for that degraded environment, so that you're not dependent on on fossil fuels, on these combustibles and consumables, you're actually going to see something very effective and very different, and that will be the driver for change. Because at the moment, yes, defence is the biggest single emitter of greenhouse gases for the UK government in many respects, but actually that means nothing. It means nothing in the big scheme of things. Changing it so that you are going to be able to have effect without that logistical chain, that is a game changer, and that will then have knock-on effects. But the interesting point here is that it's not, when you look, and I mentioned a moment ago about the Royal Navy being the catalyst for a lot of the Industrial Revolution. When you actually dive into that, the Royal Navy sets the challenge, and it's up to private enterprise who come up with the R&D to develop it and to take it bigger. And a great example of that is Isambard Kingdom Brunel and his big screw ships, his big screw-powered, propeller-powered ships. Where does he get that from? Well, he starts working on the HMS Rattler. And the HMS Rattler is the naval frigate which proves that screw propeller is better than paddle power, side paddle power. You take it small, and you can then extrapolate out from it and make it bigger. And that's what Isambard Kingdom Brunel does. It's what private enterprise does, and it's from that you end up with the dreadnoughts. You can see this direct line and this direct golden thread that comes through. So I think one of the interesting things for the UK to do is to pour money into R&D, which historically we've not been good at, certainly not in the last 30, 40 years, if not going back further. I think it was, sorry, I'm just looking for the book now. Yeah, it was Paul Kennedy who said that when you look at the Royal Navy's or the British Army, Britain's expenditure on R&D, and it's far below that of its European allies.
Who do you think needs to make that decision? Who holds that power to decide that we can invest more in R&D?
That's got to come right from the top.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a 10 Downing Street decision backed by the Treasury, because ultimately it's the Treasury who hold those purse strings. Now, the worrying thing about R&D is that it's a bit like Winston Churchill. For every 10 ideas he has, only one of them are good. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem with R&D. And it's deciding which winner to back. However, there are ways and means of doing it. And certainly in that experimental phase, it's got to be done in such a way that we're putting up the investment, the seed money, but it's other things. Sorry, the cat has just appeared. But it's other things that lead up from that and develop from that. So it's got to come from the top. It's got to come from the Treasury. It's not something the MOD can do itself, and I'd argue the Public Accounts Committee would say the same. Perhaps not the best people to do it. They don't have a great track record when it comes to projects and programs. However, you need to have those investment zones, and you need to actually work out what is not just science fiction, but what is science fact. And it's those incremental changes which will take you the rest of the way.
I think that's a really interesting point to consider, and it's something I hadn't considered before about how this power actually is with the Treasury. Do you think generally, though, that the army does take climate change seriously? Do you think there has been this cultural change in mindset to actually consider it as a threat that we should be, looking to establish a framework to tackle?
Yes.
Okay.
Short answer, yes. Because it directly impacts everything that the army does, whether it's fighting and the degraded environment it's going to be going into, and the types of environments it's going to be going into in different areas and locations, and all the way down to the military aid to the civil community and or to the civil power that it does on a yearly basis, both in the UK and further abroad. So the army gets it. I think the Navy gets it. The RAF gets it, and it gets it at that institutional level. But they also get it at the individual level, because going full circle, this matters to individual people as well.
Completely, yeah.
And a great example of that actually is RAF Akrotiri when I was out there, and AVM Snaith, Air Vice Marshal Snaith, when he was the station commander of Akrotiri, he banned disposable plastics on camp, banned straws, plastic straws, and all these kind of things from all of the establishments around camp. Why? Well, we've got turtle nesting beaches on the Akrotiri Peninsula. This isn't good for the turtles. It's not good for the environment. Let's get rid of it. So even down to the small things like that, they are making a difference, and they want to see a difference happen. It's how you actually join that up across the whole piece, and you create a coherent whole out of it. But it does start small. You do need that, and it's a dual approach, top down and bottom up.
Absolutely, I completely agree. There does have to be a middle ground between the top and the bottom in order to ensure that there is effective action essentially made to counter these challenges. I'm intrigued to know more generally how you think the world is going. I know that there are a group of academics, for example, Steven Pinker, he is quite optimistic of how the world is shifting. He thinks that at the moment we're in an unprecedented era of peace, and that war and violence are declining, and interstate wars are less likely than ever. But obviously there are academics that oppose this and think actually the world is becoming a much more violent and hostile place. From your experiences, both within the army and also within Rusi, how do you view the world going, in which direction?
I think from a personal perspective, I think we're in a worrying time. I think we're going to see more state collapse, and I think we're going to be surprised at which states we see collapsing. Historically, we shouldn't be, but I think it's going to take a few people by surprise. I think we're seeing demographic collapse in certain key areas. I mean, China demographically it just looks like it's about to fall off a cliff. So I think that's going to be an interesting one. I think additional conflict is inevitable unless we're able to start finding common ground in far more ways. I think it's hard to say this and put it into words, but I think the world is probably at a more uncertain point today than it has been for at least the last 70 years. Even when there was the great power competition between the Cold War powers, at least it was stable competition. Everyone knew the rules of the game. We're now in the position that I would argue that Colin S. Gray talks about, where you've got people testing those rules, and you're going to end up with a conflict which resets the rules. But the rules will be reset by the winning power. Now, I'm optimistic. I think those powers will be the Western powers. I think they've got the longevity and the resilience to manage it. I don't think it's going to be the autocratic powers, but it's going to take an awful lot of distress, trauma, to put it lightly, to reach that point. And I think that's where we're entering at the moment. How do we limit that? Investment. And it's got to be investment in your people, and investment in your structures, and investment in the whole force, and that means in society as well, and societal resilience. And that's whether that's industry, whether it's schooling, whether it's climate change initiatives or greening initiatives. I mean, the really interesting one is how we're going to feed the world. Mm-hmm. If we're seeing bee die off, if we're seeing all of these things, you could be looking at a very different world in the next 15, 20 years if we don't get the climate change and the climate agenda under control. And yes, militaries do have a part of that, as we've spoken about. So yeah, I think the West has the resilience to survive. I'm not sure about other places.
I think that's really interesting. I think it comes back to the idea that ensuring that we have really strong diplomatic ties with other countries, so that there isn't an opportunity for miscommunication and something dire to happen, and that actually we can discuss, ongoing issues, I think is so vital in today's world. And hopefully we will see that diplomatic engaging, continues to strengthen. Thank you so much for your insight today. It's been really fantastic to pick your brain a bit more. I always enjoy asking a lot of questions to anyone at Rusi, but sorry, I can't talk. Specifically Andy, he always has, a lot of great answers. So thank you so much. And also thank you for the opportunity for having me on. It's been a really great experience to be on the Call to Arms podcast.
Thank you, Tessa. It's been fantastic. And apologies for the gospel according to Young.
No.
They're far brainier than I in Rusi. I'm just the poor boy who makes the tea. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.